Hello, everyone, and welcome to the lecture on Yevgeny Zamyatin. Yevgeny Zamyatin was a less prolific author than many of the authors we've seen so far, and his career was comparatively short, but he turned out to be one of the most influential authors for world literature in the 20th century. So I feel like we really should read him and discuss him. Zamyatin was born in the Tambov region, and his father was a priest and his mother was a pianist. So he was from the educated classes, but just barely. He was not of the nobility, but he wasn't of the peasant or working class either. He was from this very sort of minor, what we might call petit bourgeois, except not really. He was from this sort of very minor, low-level intellectual class. He later went to school in Voronezh and then went to college in St. Petersburg, where he studied shipbuilding, and he became a naval engineer. During this time, while he was in college in St. Petersburg, he joined the Bolsheviks and was very committed to the Bolshevik cause. He happened to witness the mutiny on the battleship Potyomkin and was involved in Bolshevik political activities. This got him into a fair amount of trouble with the current regime, unsurprisingly, but nonetheless, he had valuable skills as a naval engineer, and he was sent to England in 1916 to work on Russian icebreakers. Russia was constructing icebreakers at English wharfs in Newcastle and places like that, and he was sent there to work on them. So that was an interesting thing. Apparently, he became quite English while he was there, and became a fan of English culture, although he also wrote satirical accounts of it. And as you might guess from the fact that he joined the Bolsheviks, he was very pro-Bolshevik, very pro-communist, and a big supporter of the revolution when it first happened. He was in England during the February Revolution, which he was very sorry to miss, but he came back to Russia in time to witness the October Revolution and was a strong supporter of the revolution and the Bolshevik cause. Zamyatin started publishing short stories in 1908, and he continued to write short stories for the next 10 years. They were frequently satirical, often with a sort of sci-fi element to them, and he wrote these throughout the 1910s as he was studying and then as he was in England. And these stories, and we're going to read one of them, are interesting enough, but if he had just written them, he would have been a very minor footnote in Russian literary history. The thing that vaulted him into the big time was his novel Мы, or We, which he wrote in 1920. And Мы, or We, is considered to be the foundation novel of the genre of dystopian sci-fi. There had been some dystopian works written before. Russian writers were some of the first to write dystopian works. So, for example, Yevgeny Zamyatin, whom we read earlier in the semester, wrote a kind of a dystopian poem called Последняя смерть, The Last Death, which has this dystopian sci-fi element to it. But it wasn't until Zamyatin, 100 years later, wrote We that the genre of dystopian sci-fi novel really was created and became a foundational genre for 20th and 21st century literature. By this time, Zamyatin was already becoming disillusioned with the Soviet system, and We can certainly be seen as a harsh critique of the path that the Soviet system was already on. If you haven't read it, it's about a totalitarian state that seems utopian, but is in fact deeply dystopian. And the main character engages in a rebellion against this totalitarian state. It's not specifically about the Soviet Union, but it is about the dangers of totalitarianism and utopianism, which were really big then. That is to say, totalitarianism as a state system was on the rise, and people were very caught up in these utopian ideals, whether they be communist, whether they be Nazi, whether they be democratic. There was a big belief in bringing about a utopian future through a totalitarian state. And "we" is basically a satire of this and a warning about how it can go horribly, horribly wrong. And "We" has the honor of being the first book banned by the Soviet censorship board in 1921. Zamyatin, however, believed in his book, and so he didn't stop there, and it was smuggled abroad and published first in English translation, then it was translated into, I believe, Czech and French. Eventually it was published in the original Russian, but abroad. It was not actually published in Russia until 1988. Because of this novel, Zamyatin was sentenced to exile. Then he was allowed to stay, but he finally left the USSR in 1931, 10 years later, after he sent a personal request directly to Stalin to be allowed to leave. And one of the interesting things about the Stalinist period was that Stalin took a great deal of interest in art and literature. I read somewhere recently about how if you want to see what a state run by an editor looks like, look at Stalinist Russia. Stalin was quite interested in literature. He was a semi-decent writer himself, and apparently a very active and one might even say in some ways good editor. And he took a lot of editorial interest in what was being written and published in the Soviet Union. And writers frequently contacted him personally or appealed to him personally about their circumstances. And so, for example, we heard how Lily Brick wrote to him and interceded on behalf of Mayakovsky after Mayakovsky's death. And Zamyatin also wrote on his own behalf to Stalin and was given personal permission to leave, which he did in 1931. He then went to France, like many Russian emigres, where he died in 1937. So, like I said, Zamyatin didn't write or publish a huge amount during his lifetime. If he had been a slightly less good writer or slightly less lucky, for want of a better word, I hate to call him a lucky writer, but he wrote the right thing at the right time and managed to get it published, which is certainly due to his own effort and talent, but also due to luck. But that being said, he did not produce a huge amount of literature, but the fact that he wrote "we" meant that he had this sort of towering influence on world literature. And as I said, "we" created the genre of dystopian sci-fi. It prefigured Brave New World and 1984. There's some discussion of how much it influenced A Brave New World, with Huxley claiming that he was not aware of "we" before he wrote A Brave New World. It definitely heavily influenced 1984, and Orwell has said directly that 1984 was influenced by "we", and many other things. And just this whole genre of dystopian sci-fi, especially about totalitarian states, continues to be an immensely popular and influential genre in world literature. So if you have read The Hunger Games or seen the Hunger Games movies, that is very much based on this genre of dystopian sci-fi about a totalitarian state. And so we owe that genre, we owe the creation of that genre to Zamyatin. And all kinds of works, including The Hunger Games, A Wrinkle in Time, 1984, all of them, you can see pretty much the direct descendants, the direct relationship between them and "we", even if the authors have not specifically read "we", the tropes and the characters and the storylines that it created are still being recreated and re-represented and presented in dystopian sci-fi. It's interesting that there's sort of two trends in dystopian sci-fi. We have dystopian sci-fi about totalitarian states and post-apocalyptic dystopian sci-fi. The Hunger Games, you could argue, is both. I mean, it's a post-apocalyptic society, but it's also a totalitarian society. And interestingly, Russian authors were some of the first to write in both those genres. So Borotinsky's The Last Death, Последняя смерть, from 1828, if I remember correctly, is very much this post-apocalyptic sci-fi. in which the narrator is looking on the smoldering remnants of a post-apocalyptic world where almost everyone has died out. Zamyatin's characters in Mui are living in this totalitarian society that appears to be utopian, but is in fact deeply dystopian. And so both of those strains were pretty much created by Russian artists, or at least Russian artists were some of the first to write in that genre and that strain, and we still write in them today. And if you have not read We, I strongly recommend reading it. You basically cannot understand contemporary science fiction and contemporary dystopian literature without reading We.